Let's step into a highly controlled environment. The air is still. The lighting is deliberate. We are about to look at the clinical, calculated mechanics of human deception and disclosure. This explainer is a forensic analysis of how the human mind reacts under immense, targeted cognitive pressure.
What if the most powerful interrogation tool isn't force, but the human mind itself? Today, we're stepping inside real interrogation rooms to uncover what actually breaks criminals.
Section 1. Setting the baseline. To understand how these behavioral responses are triggered today, we really have to look at how the science of extraction has evolved. Criminological strategy has undergone a distinct evolution over time. Before the 20th century, investigators relied almost entirely on physical coercion, threats, and outright torture. But from a forensic standpoint, this was highly flawed. Extreme physical pain forces a person's brain into pure survival mode. In that state of agony, a suspect will say absolutely anything just to make the pain stop, which produced massive rates of false confessions and legally unreliable evidence. The critical shift happened right in the mid-20th century. Investigators realized that the manipulation of perception was vastly more effective than physical force. And now we're analyzing another shift toward ethical, evidence-based interviewing. But to understand that modern shift, we have to look closely at what happened in the middle. What investigators understand is that a modern interrogation is definitely not an improvised conversation. It's a highly structured psychological process. We've all experienced everyday pressure to agree with someone, maybe in a meeting or an intense argument. But an interrogation engineers that social pressure into a precise, calculated science. It relies heavily on cognitive psychology, behavioral science, and social influence theory. The ultimate goal is to maneuver a suspect into a position where holding on to a lie becomes psychologically heavier than simply telling the truth.
Section 2. The Reid Technique Framework.
For decades in the United States, that structured process has been dominated by one specific framework. The Reid Technique is essentially a weaponization of cognitive pressure, broken down into a very calculated three-phase progression. First is fact analysis, which is just reviewing the physical evidence. Second is the behavioral analysis interview, a non-accusatory phase to establish baselines. But here's where it gets interesting. Phase 3, the actual interrogation, only begins when the investigator makes a strict assumption of guilt. From this point forward, the investigator isn't looking for answers. They're looking for cracks.
Section 3. Tactics that break minds.
Once that third phase begins, the room becomes a psychological pressure cooker. The first core strategy is maximization. This is a psychological pressure tactic specifically designed to induce profound fear and anxiety. Imagine a detective standing right over you, invading your physical space, looking down and painting a vivid, terrifying picture of an inevitable 20-year prison sentence if you don't cooperate. From a criminological perspective, this creates a perception that conviction is inescapable. It triggers compliance-based confessions. The suspect begins to feel that the absolutely only way to survive the immediate threat in the room is to agree with the interrogator. Now contrast that with its psychological opposite, minimization. If maximization is the stick, minimization is the perceived carrot. Here, the interrogator's tone completely shifts. They become your confidant. They downplay the seriousness of the crime. They offer moral excuses, suggest the act was totally understandable, or display deep empathy. This is highly effective because it reduces the suspect's internal conflict. It creates a powerful illusion of leniency, tricking the suspect's brain into thinking a confession won't actually ruin their life. You'll often hear interrogators use a phrase exactly like this. Anyone in your situation would have done the same. This is theme development at its absolute most potent. It provides a psychological exit ramp. It frames the crime as a momentary lapse in judgment rather than malicious intent, making the act of confessing feel psychologically acceptable and maybe even safe.
Then there is the false evidence ploy. Interrogators present completely fabricated evidence, fake DNA reports, non-existent witnesses, or fabricated surveillance data to convince the suspect that denial is utterly futile. The psychological effect of this is devastating. It completely shatters the suspect's confidence in their own defense. Surprisingly, in many jurisdictions, this tactic is completely legal. And while it drastically increases the likelihood of a confession, research shows it vastly increases the risk of false confessions, particularly among individuals who are mentally vulnerable or totally exhausted.
Another clinical approach is increasing the suspect's cognitive load. Maintaining a fabricated story requires immense working memory. Think about it. Try telling the story of your day yesterday in reverse chronological order. It takes immense mental bandwidth. Now imagine doing that while defending your freedom against trained investigators. Interrogators will deliberately overload the brain's cognitive capacity by asking for reverse-order storytelling, repeating questions in rapid succession, or injecting unexpected variables. Under this targeted pressure, the human mind rarely stays consistent. Liars will display behavioral leakage and narrative inconsistencies, whereas truth-tellers generally remain stable.
Sometimes the most intense pressure comes from nothing at all: strategic silence. By simply stopping and staring, interrogators create an unbearable psychological discomfort. The human brain naturally wants to resolve the tension of a completely quiet room. In a desperate attempt to fill that silence, suspects frequently make unplanned, damaging disclosures. But these tactics carry a profound cost. When you apply this level of sustained cognitive stress, the results aren't always accurate.
Section 4. The psychological fallout.
We have to ask a really critical question from a forensic psychology standpoint. What happens when the mind breaks the wrong way? Prolonged deception tactics and psychological exhaustion don't just break guilty people, they break innocent people too.
There are 3 distinct psychological mechanisms behind false confessions. First is compliance. The suspect simply wants to escape the intense stress of the room, believing they can sort out the truth later when they are finally allowed to leave. Second is suggestibility, where vulnerable individuals, perhaps juveniles or those with lower cognitive processing abilities, simply adopt the investigator's aggressive narrative just to appease them. But the most chilling is internalization. Under extreme conditions like sleep deprivation and high-pressure tactics, the suspect actually begins to believe they committed the crime, forming a completely fabricated memory of the event entirely constructed by the interrogation itself.
These mechanisms map directly onto the 3 types of false confessions seen in criminal justice: voluntary, compliant, and internalized. An internalized false confession is arguably the most terrifying, because the suspect's grip on reality has been so thoroughly dismantled that they will confess with genuine emotion to a crime they never committed. The defining pattern in these cases is that the confession usually contradicts the hard forensic evidence, yet the suspect has entirely adopted the investigator's narrative. It is a total collapse of cognitive autonomy.
Section 5. The ethical interviewing era.
Because of these high-risk psychological fallouts and the rise of DNA exonerations, the global criminal justice system has begun to adapt. When we contrast the traditional American framework with the modern global trend, a stark difference emerges. The Reid technique is confession-driven. It relies on deception, manipulation, and the strict assumption of guilt. Meanwhile, the peace model, developed in the UK, is strictly information-driven. It is a non-coercive structure focused entirely on gathering verifiable accounts rather than extracting a confession at all costs. The data clearly shows this approach reduces wrongful convictions while still successfully uncovering the truth through evidence-based practices.
Interrogation isn't about force. It's about understanding the human mind at its most vulnerable. If you found this analysis insightful, comment your thoughts on this video. Also, subscribe to us to see more videos like this in the future. See you in the next video.